morning. So, some of you have maybe heard part of this story, but the ending will come as a bit of a surprise. But a couple years ago, Krista and I took the stimulus checks, or Trump bucks as we called them, to go on vacation. And you might think to yourself, that's a dumb way to use that. Probably right, but we'd been in ministry 15 straight years at that point, and in our whole marriage, we'd never had a vacation of any type. And so we were able to book like a 5-star all-inclusive resort in the Dominican through Costco, because they do sell everything for like half price. So like, you know what, we may never get this chance again. And so we did it, and we were so excited. We looked forward to this trip more than anything in recent memory. But it got started out a little rough. We had to leave our house something like 3 a.m. to get to the airport on time so that we could get to the Dominican. And we're like, you know what, that stinks. We're not going to sleep, but we'll just sleep on the plane. Right? We'll wake up, we'll have a beach, we'll have a full day of vacation. So not a big deal. We get to the airport the next morning around 5 a.m., and everybody's kind of complaining a little bit. Like, what in the world's happening here? As we get closer to the front of the line, what we find out is our airline had apparently known the night before that they were pushing our flight back 10 hours due to mechanical issues, but they hadn't remembered to tell anybody that. And so our whole flight had showed up, and now we had like 10 hours instead of sleeping in our own beds to sleep at the airport. But we're like, well, you got to do what you got to do. And so the problem with that wasn't just that we're going to miss a whole day of vacation. See, we'd never done these resort things, these all-inclusive things before, so we didn't really know this, but I guess with a lot of them, you have to like go see a concierge, just like your private concierge, and they schedule everything for you. And so when we miss our meeting with our concierge and we can't see him for like 48 hours, all of that stuff that we had prepaid for, we couldn't take advantage of. So instead of going to like the steakhouses and getting seafood, and steaks, like we could only eat the buffet. Right? And so that was frustrating, but at least we're in the Dominican, right? At least we've got the beach, or we would have if it hadn't been for that pesky tropical storm that kept us from getting in the water. So that was frustrating. Friends, we spent most of that first half of the vacation literally in our hotel room. We couldn't even figure out how to turn on the TV. So binge watching Cobra Kai on Netflix and eating from our minibar. Like, I'm pretty sure we could have done that from Illinois, right? We didn't really have to be overseas for that. And so we had all these high expectations. We were excited, and then it just didn't happen, right? We were frustrated. And so Krista, I think the worst part of all, she decided, well, at least I'm going to get a tan, right? And so she goes out on the balcony, and she spends a day tanning, but it was cloudy because of the tropical storms, and so she ends up burnt to a crisp, like level 5 or 6 sunburn. I mean, her skin is bleeding, it's raised, it's red. And so at this point, we're at the end of the trip. She's in pain. We just want to go home. We just want to get to our bed. We just want to sleep in our house before we have to go back to work. And so we're done with it. Problem with that is we still have to fly home yet. And we were flying American, a random airline, okay, that nobody's ever heard of before. And since Krista had flown the whole trip in crying because we were missing a couple days of vacation, they must have assumed, let's make her cry on the way home too. So they sat her next to a young man that must have never flown before. He was so nervous, his legs were bouncing up and down the entire flight, rubbing up against Krista's legs that were like bleeding because they were so burnt. And so I kept hitting him and be like, hey, dude, stop it, please. Like, my wife is in so much pain. Can you just stop moving your leg? But he didn't for the whole trip. And so Krista is clinging to me. She is crying the whole trip. It's awful. I cannot tell you how much we just want it to be over. We get to Miami, quick 2-hour layover before we go back home. We're this close to getting home. We get to our gate, and there's about 30 people there. And I turn to Chris and I say, there is no way they're letting us fly with just 30 people on this plane. Seconds later, here comes the intercom. We regret to inform you, we see some weather patterns in the forecast that we're not comfortable flying in, and so we're going to cancel your flight. Please go to customer service desk to get a refund on your tickets and to reschedule your flight. Really? So we get to the customer service counter. We're the last ones there because Krista's walking like she's 90 years old at that point. And everybody's grumbling, like kind of under their breath. But I was done. Under your breath grumbling was not good enough in this situation. So we get to the back of the line. And you know, like Chris and I for the most part now, right? Like, we're pretty calm. Like, I would say we're even, dare I say, nice people, generally grace-filled. Not in this moment. So we get to the back of the line, and we start to heckle the customer service reps. Like, not like a little, like loudly. Like holding up our phones, we're like, I'll show you my radar if you show me yours, right? Because there's nothing on there. They come on the loudspeaker, we boo them. Like, we turned those 30 people into a mob. And we were happy about it. Let me ask you this. Have you ever found yourself in a moment where maybe you lost sight of who you are for just a second? Like you forgot who you were? See, here's how this generally happens. We find ourselves in a situation, and almost always there's two things happening. Almost always you're tired and you're in grief. Now, that grief doesn't mean you're experiencing necessarily just a loss of like a loved one. It could be grief of like, oh, we were supposed to have a good vacation and it was awful, right? And so you find yourself in these situations, you're tired and you're in grief. And suddenly, you forget who you are. And you start to make some decisions. You start to say some things. You start to do some things. And then when the storm calms down, even if you can't see it on radar, whatever that storm in your life is, right? When that starts to calm down, you look up, and all you have left is guilt and shame that you have done this thing, that you have said this thing, and there's nothing you can do to change it. Have you ever been there? We're in week 4 of our reaction series. We're looking at 4 reactions of the early tomb from 4 of Jesus' early followers. And this week, what we're looking at is the reaction of Peter. And I think it's the most interesting of all. I love Simon Peter's story, but it's going to be most interesting not only what his struggle is that we can relate to, not only what his reaction to the tomb is and how it impacts his struggle, but it's just going to be interesting because of all the apostles, I feel like Simon Peter's faith was maybe the most erratic, right? He had these high highs, he had these low lows. He always has this kind of pattern of his following of Jesus. It's just really erratic. And I think sometimes we can relate to that. But when I look at Peter's story, what I see in his pattern is this over and over again. He has these really high moments, and then he has these low moments. But in between, there's a moment where he loses himself, where he kind of forgets who he is. And it's in these moments that he forgets who he is, that he makes some decisions, that he says some things, that he does some things that he can't take back, that fill him with guilt, that fill him with shame, and he doesn't know where to go from there. And so the question we're going to try to answer this morning is, when we find ourselves in that situation, when we've lost sight of who we are, when we've said some things or done some things that we can't take back, when we're sitting in our guilt, when we're sitting in our shame, where do we go from there? See, what I think we're going to learn from Peter this week is this. The first thing we need to remember is that even when our pursuit is erratic, his purpose still endures. See, we have to remember that even when we don't follow Jesus in the straight line we want to, that the plans he has for us, they haven't changed, right? And so that's what we're going to learn. And we're going to learn that by starting in the book of Luke this morning. And we're going to start in Luke chapter 22, reading verses 31 through 34. And in Luke, this is what we read. It says, Jesus is there, and they're reclining at the Last Supper, and he feels the need to have this private conversation with Peter. And so he says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. Okay, and so here's what's happening. Jesus has this private conversation with Peter. Satan has asked for permission, and I've granted him permission to test you and the other disciples. Now, I'm not sure how that happens. Like, I don't know if there's like a form you fill out or what, like, hey, can I test the disciples? Like, Jesus has to email back, yep, sure, go at it. I don't know what that looks like. I just know that Satan has asked permission and received it from Jesus. He gets to test the disciples. And so he turns to Simon. He's like, Simon needs to know this. And so he says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But we don't miss this. Whenever God says 2 names in a row, very, very, very rare in Scripture, right? Whenever he says 2 names in a row, it's special. It's important. We're going to call it a moment of divine urgency where God is about to elevate someone's calling. Okay, that's what he does. For instance, he says, Abraham, Abraham, right when he's about to kill his son as a sacrifice in faithful obedience. And God says, don't do that. Because of your faithfulness, I'm establishing my covenant with you. Right? So Abraham, Abraham, and he elevates his calling because of his faithful obedience. He does it with Moses, right? Moses is in the desert at the burning bush, and he says, Moses, Moses. So he's calling him out from being a shepherd in the desert to God's mouthpiece in Egypt. He's elevating his calling. We see it a couple times in the New Testament. Saul, Saul, right? Where God calls Saul out of his pharisaical lifestyle and into a mouthpiece for God, writes most of our New Testament. right? And so when Jesus says here, Simon, Simon, it's not just a moment of divine urgency. He's about to elevate his calling, right? And there's something about elevating this calling that before he can do it, Peter must be first tested. Okay, and so Jesus then goes on to say this, but I have prayed for you. Well, that's good to know. Listen, my grandma, right before she died, it might literally have been the last words she said to me. She said, I'm going to go up to heaven, and I'm going to pray, and I'm going to tap Jesus on the shoulder and tell him to give you and Krista a boy. Right? Because William Arnold's in my family for like 13 generations, and we're the last shot at it, right? We just had Essie, so she's like, that's not going to cut it. So she's like, I'm going to go up to Jesus and say, you're going to have a boy. Listen, I don't think I have a choice with this, right? If she's up there in heaven tapping Jesus on the shoulder, I guess I'm having a boy. Like, I don't get a choice, right? I'm confident that's going to happen. Well, how much more confident would you be if Jesus himself was praying for you? Like, there's not even anybody going to Jesus on your path. It's Jesus. He says, Peter, guess what? Good news. You're going to be tested, but I, myself, I'm going to pray for you. Good news. Pray what? Because this gets interesting. Simon, your faith may not fail. Okay, that's good. But then something strange. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Hard stop. So Jesus says, I'm going to pray for your faith that it will not fail. And when you have turned back, you can't turn back unless you first turned away. So I'm going to pray for you in your testing that your faith will not fail. And yet in the middle of that testing, you're going to turn away. And when you turn back, I will elevate your calling as a leader in the church, as a leader of my people. How does that work? Here's what you need to understand about Peter. He's got this pattern we've been talking about already. And his pattern is big faith, loses sight of who he is, big fail. Big faith, loses sight of who he is, big fail. Look up Peter's story. You're going to see it all the way through his story. But we're going to look at just one instance. We're going to go all the way back to Matthew. And we're going to read in Matthew chapter 16 about a really big moment in Peter's faith journey. It's one of the first confessions of who Jesus is. Because this is what's happening in Matthew 16:13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, others Jeremiah, one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell won't overcome it. In fact, I'll give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Whew! Big faith moment. Peter says, you are the Son of God, and Jesus says, great answer. And you are Peter, Petra, rock, you're my rock. And on this rock, your confession of faith in me, I will build my church. And oh, the way by we're at it, hell can't even overcome it. And whatever you loose in heaven and on earth, it's going to be connected. You're going to have all this power. In other words, Peter, you dumb man. Right? 2 verses later, starting in 21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. What? Never, Lord, he said. This shall never happen to you. And Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And then Jesus said, this is very important. He said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me, they will find it. Big faith, you are the Son of God. Forgets himself, right? Because who is he? What is his identity? He is a follower of Jesus. But suddenly he thinks Jesus is a follower of Peter. He forgets himself. Big fail. And at the end of this big fail, Jesus says something very important. Do you really want to know, because it's early on in the ministry, do you really want to know what it means to follow me? Die. Take up your cross Die to yourself and follow after me. When you lose your life for my sake, that's when you find it. That's going to be really important. Okay? And so this is the pattern I want you to keep in mind. Big faith, forgets who he is, big fail, right? So we're going to go back to Luke now again, back to verse 33. And so we have the situation where Satan's testing Peter, right? And so far, we've had a big faith moment, right? Simon Peter, Satan's going to test you like you're worthy of being tested. And then Jesus says, but here's the thing. In the middle of this testing, you're going to turn away, right? Because he says if you got to turn back, that means you have to turn away. So he says, by the way, in the middle of this testing, you're going to turn away. And here's where Peter starts to lose himself again, because he's going to have a lot of confidence, but not in Jesus, in himself. Because Jesus says, Peter, you're going to turn away. And then Peter replied, Lord, I am ready. I am ready to go with you to prison. I am ready to go with you to death. I got this. Big confidence in the wrong person. So Peter says, you think you're ready? I tell you this, before the rooster crows today, forget about dying for me. Forget about going to prison with me. Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times that you even know me. Big faith, moment of forgetting himself. You ready to see the failure? Forgetting who he is and the decisions he makes? We're going to jump over to verse 54. And in verse 54, Jesus has just been taken into custody in the Garden of Gethsemane. And this is what we read. It says, then seizing him, they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest. This verse is very important. Peter followed at a distance. That's a big word. See, up to this point, Peter's been following closely. Now Peter's following at a distance. That's going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem because when you lose sight of who you're following, you lose sight of who you are. And when you lose sight of who you are, that's when you start to make these decisions that you can't take back. These decisions that riddle you with guilt and with shame and that you can do nothing about. Because here's what's going to happen next. It says in verse 55, and some there had kindled a fire in the middle of a courtyard and sat down together. Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, this man was with him. But he denied it. Woman, I don't know him, he said. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. This is a servant girl. It has zero authority. There's zero risk to Peter in saying, yeah, I know him. None at all. And yet this servant girl comes up and Peter goes, I don't even know what you're talking about. Get away. Casual, calm, small. But the story doesn't end there, does it? Because it keeps going. 58, a little later, someone else saw him and said, you are also one of them. He says, man, I am not, Peter replied. Notice the exclamation point. His tone is changing. So now it's just like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's like, hey, dude, I don't know what you're talking about. There's a sense of escalation. Then look at the next verse. 59, about an hour later, another asserted, certainly this fellow was with him, for he is Galilean. Peter replied, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Go ahead in your mind and imagine 2 exclamation points there. The other Gospels tell us at this point Peter begins to curse. He's profanity-laced at this point. Did y'all see Jerry Springer died this week? This is an episode of Jerry Springer. All right, because here's what's happening. Peter went from, I don't know what you're talking about, to man, I don't know what you're talking about, to dude, I don't freaking know what you're talking about. Get away from me, right? I swear on my mother's life, I don't know this dude. Get the blippity bleep 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 out of my face. That escalated quickly. Why? Because here's the thing. There's something about denying Jesus just a little bit that when it goes unchecked, it escalates quickly. Let me say that again. There's something about denying Jesus just a little bit that when it goes unchecked, it escalates quickly. There's something about forgetting ourselves just a little bit and who we are and who we're following that when it goes unchecked, it escalates quickly. Now, I've been in ministry for a little bit now, and I have no problem telling you that those early years sometimes were rough, not just on me, but I'm sure I was rough on other people. Right? I had a lot of maturity. I had to grow into some things. And early on, I cared a lot about what people thought of me. Right? I wanted to be the cool pastor. And you know me enough to know that that's not possible no matter what I say or do. Right? but like I was worried, like I didn't want to say things that would upset people, maybe run them off. Like I didn't want to, it was a reflection on me whether if the church was dying because the word, right? So I had all these concerns. But as I matured, God has not just matured me, he's increased my love for you more than for myself. And so where I find myself now is I don't care what you think of me. I care more what God thinks of you. Okay, I care more about your relationship with Jesus. I care more about your relationship with your kids. I care more about your marriage. I care more about your eternity than what you think of me. And so here's what I'm going to tell you. I used to tell people, I'd run into them at Walmart, and they'd be like, put their head down, I'm sorry, Pastor, I haven't been to church in 3 months. Like, it's me, no worries, right? Now, I'm not saying if you miss church every now and then that like you're not following Jesus. That's not what I'm saying. I know that. But listen, I don't care what you think anymore. I need to tell you the truth. And the truth is, when we let one little thing, just one little thing, like for a short period of time, be more important than Jesus, than worship, the path from there to Jesus not making the top 10 list of most important things in our life, that journey happens a lot quicker than you think. Seriously, I have had people, and this is difficult to think about, but I've had people that when they first come to Jesus, man, they're on fire. And they're in the church, they're in small group, they're involved. Anytime they can worship Jesus, they're there. Doors open, they're there. And then something comes up in life. Circumstances change. They have a kid. There's ball tournaments. They get a new job. They're busy. COVID hits. We're just going to watch online for a little bit. And what goes from, well, Jesus is like everything. Like he's the biggest thing in my life. He's my priority to once a month, to once a quarter, to Easter and Christmas, to online only, to nowhere. I have had so many people come up to me 10, 15 years later, and they're cursing God. And they're saying, I follow God, but my marriage is in shambles. My kid's flunking out of college because they're getting stoned on the weekends. I don't know, he might have someone pregnant. My whole life's falling apart. Where is God? Curse God that he let. When did this start to happen? And I say, back there. It didn't happen today. It happened back there. Because the moment that we put anything in our priority list above God, if worshiping God isn't our top priority, pretty soon he won't be any priority. Listen, that's the pattern. And so I know that sounds harsh. I'm not trying to be legalistic. That's not what this is. This is a lifestyle. What I'm trying to tell you is I care more about you than me. So be mad at me if you want, but there's nothing more important than worshiping God. Because the further we get from him, the greater the distance, the more we lose sight of him, the more we lose sight of who we are. I don't want you in that guilt. I don't want you in that shame. I don't want your marriage in shambles. I don't want your kids not talking to you. I want to spend eternity with you, so I have to tell you the truth. There is nothing more important than stopping that pattern before it gets too far. One little thing turns to one more thing, turns to one big thing, and before you know it, he's not even up there on that list. He's not the most important thing. And so I think what Peter's showing us here is kind of a microcosm of that, right? He does the same thing. He just tells God, hey, I'm going to get tested. No worries. I've got this. Jesus, there is nothing in this life, nothing that's going to get me to deny you. It's just a work trip. It's just a tournament. It's just a small season where I get used to my new job. There's nothing. Don't worry. I got this. And then what happens? After 60, Peter replied, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Cursey, curse, bleep. Then the Lord, just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned, this breaks my heart, he looked straight at Peter. And in that moment, Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and he wept bitterly. I don't want you weeping bitterly. Don't miss this. He was following Jesus closely, and then he was following Jesus from a distance. Now he's left Jesus. He went outside. He was following Jesus closely. He was following Jesus from a distance, and then he leaves Jesus. And when you're not in the presence of Christ, the only thing left to do is to weep bitterly. Friends, that pattern happens quicker than you think. And so here's Peter. He has just denied Jesus. Denied even knowing him. He's cursed his name. After that, Jesus looks straight at him, Peter realizes what he's done. He leaves Jesus. He weeps bitterly, and then what happens? Jesus dies. Where does Peter go from there? Where do you take that guilt? Jesus is dead. Where do you take that shame? Where do you take these decisions? See, here's what you need to know, friends. We talked in week 1 of this series about how John's perspective of the tomb was influenced by John's perspective of the cross. You remember that? Well, Peter's perspective of the tomb is related to Peter's perspective of this faith journey, this inconsistency in his walk. Okay, you have to understand both. And in John 20:1-10, which we read in week 1, you got to remember, John and Peter are in the same place. They're both grieving. They're both tired. Okay, they both together do something culturally unacceptable. When they hear something's up with the tomb, they both sprint to the tomb. In this moment, they are in the same place. But when they get to the tomb, John can't go in. John's been faithful. John was at the cross. Peter, nobody knows where Peter was. In his shame and guilt, he had disappeared. John was at the cross. He couldn't go in. He couldn't bring himself to get his hopes up that just maybe, like he couldn't get hurt again, right? But what does Peter do? He sprints not just to the tomb, he sprints in the tomb. So at this point, their stories delineate. They go 2 different directions. Why? Because John was faithful. Peter was desperate. John was faithful. Peter was desperate. The last thing he had ever done with Jesus was to deny him 3 times. And then Jesus looked at him, and then Jesus died, and Peter had nowhere to go. I had a friend, many churches ago at this point, not middle-aged even, somewhat younger, got in a fight with his wife, said some things he didn't mean. Types of things when you forget who you are. Some of that Jerry Springer profanity laced in there. They said, this to you, why don't you just go die? I don't even care. You know what happened? She died before he ever spoke to her again. Unexpected. You want to guess how that person's doing right now? Not good. Why did Peter sprint into the tomb? Why did he run straight into the tomb? Because he desperately needed Jesus to not be in the tomb. Because if Jesus was still in that tomb, Peter's life was over. Friends, if Jesus' body was still in that tomb, Peter's life was over. But here's his response to the tomb. Luke 24:12. It said this, Peter, however, got up and he ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. So what's Peter's struggle? Well, he's got an identity crisis. He keeps forgetting who he is, and when he forgets who he is, he makes these decisions that he can't take back that fills him with all this guilt and all of this shame. And what's his reaction to the tomb? I love this. He runs to the tomb in desperation, but he walks away in deliberation. See, we're not told that he believes in Jesus in the tomb. We're told John does. We're just told that Peter goes into the tomb and he walks away wondering. Right? And so he runs to the tomb in desperation. His life is spinning out of the control. He doesn't know where to go. He just needs something to be different. He doesn't know what. He sees the empty tomb. He doesn't walk away believing. He just walks away in deliberation. Maybe things aren't as they seem. And listen, Peter thinking about something, I mean, that feels like a step of spiritual maturity for him in the first place, right? So it's a good thing. He doesn't believe, but he walks away at least thinking about it. And so how did his reaction to the tomb change his struggle? Well, I think we need the rest of the story for that, don't we? And so I'm going to finish up with these verses here this morning. John 21, we're going to be reading verses 1-7 and 15-19. And so at this point, Jesus appeared to the disciples twice after his resurrection, both in the locked room that we read about, week of Thomas. It's the third time. This is what happens. It says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, right? And so this is where they run away, right? But then here's what's going to happen. After they go to the tomb, after they see it's empty, after Jesus appears to him twice, Jesus appears this third time, he's going to be on a beach. Skipping over to verse 24, it says, now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. And so the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. All right, and so now we're getting into this thing where we're looking at Thomas, right? And he doesn't know, and he's like, I don't have this faith. Where is Jesus? Like, I need all this faith. And we keep reading, and we get to this journey, and we're going to get all the way over to John 21. And we're going to get to verse 1. Again, this is the third time. It says, afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat. But that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. When they did, they were unable to haul in the net because of the large number of fish. Watch what happens. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him and jumped into the water. And Peter's going to have this moment with Jesus on the beach, starting in verse 15. It says, when they had finished, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. 3 denials, 3 affirmations. The third time he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Jesus knows where Peter's at. He's in his guilt. He's in his shame. Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all these things. You know that I love you. Jesus said this, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. You did what you wanted. But when you're old, when you're mature, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death to which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, follow me. Friends, even when we are not faithful in our following, Jesus is always faithful. And what he's showing Peter here, it doesn't matter how distant you've become. It doesn't matter how far you've walked away. It doesn't matter your guilt. It doesn't matter your shame. The same thing I called you to at the beginning, I called you to today. Glorify me. Glorify me. Your calling hasn't changed. Just because you've walked away from me, it doesn't mean the calling's changed. I knew who you were before I gave you the calling. The calling doesn't change. Friends, you cannot disqualify yourself from the calling God has on your life. Like, there's nothing that you can do that can make God feel any different about you. There's nothing you can do that can change what he offered for you. There's nothing that you can do in this life that changes the plans he has for you. You can't. You can't disqualify yourself from the calling that God has in your life. No matter how many mistakes we've made, no matter how bad they've been, we just can't. We're not that powerful. But here's what I really want to take this morning. Because we talk about that verse where Jesus says, I pray that your faith will not fail, and when you turn back, right? So what Jesus is telling us here is the determination of our faith isn't about our disobedience necessarily. I walked away, so I didn't love Jesus. No, the true determination of our faith is when we get distant from Jesus, do we keep going that way, or do we run back to Jesus? Friends, the true determination of your faith is when we're in these moments of disobedience, do we run further away or do we run back to Jesus and let him restore us? That's what Jesus is saying, true faith. That's why David was a man after God's own heart, because despite his ugly sin, murder, adultery, he always ran back to God. The true determination of our faith is when we do turn away, do we keep going away or do we come back to God? Because if we keep going this way, then our faith was in ourselves the whole time. But if we come back to Jesus, then our faith was in Jesus. And so here's where I'm going with that, friends. Do you want to know the power of the empty tomb this morning? Because here's the power of the empty tomb. This same story, the fish, the boat, other side, that's somewhere else in the scripture. 3 years earlier, when Jesus first calls the disciples. Right, what's he do? Jesus shows up on a beach. Peter's fishing. He says, have you caught anything? They say no. He says, put your nets on the other side. They pick it up. There's so many fish, they can't get them all into the boat. Right? You remember this? When Peter first meets Jesus? And then let's put that verse up here. Here's Peter's reaction the first time. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and he said, go away from me. Lord, I am a sinful man. And then Jesus said to Simon, don't be afraid, from now on you'll fish for people. And that's where he goes on to say, follow me. What in the world has the power to change, go away from me, I'm a sinful man, into jumping out of the boat and getting to Jesus as fast as possible? The tomb, the empty tomb. It changes Peter from someone that says, go away from me, I'm sinful, to I have to get as close to you as possible despite my sin, despite my guilt, despite my shame. Only the empty tomb does that. And here's what we try to do. This is our struggle, right? When we're in our sin, when we're in our shame, when we're in our guilt, we distance ourselves from Jesus. And we say, whether we say it out loud or not, away from me, for I'm unworthy. Or we say, I've got this, no big deal, you don't need to worry about it. It doesn't matter. Either way, we distance ourselves from Jesus. And when we lose sight of who we're following, we lose sight of who we are. And that's when we make these decisions. That's when we're in shame. That's when we're in guilt. And friends, even as Christians, we do some gnarly things. We cheat on our spouses. We murder babies. We get drunk in a car and we kill somebody while we're driving. We also look at a website on the internet. We lust in our hearts. We lie about someone. We gossip. It's all the same stuff. Jesus says as much. But do you know what his response is? To everybody, no matter the situation, no matter how gnarly the sin, no matter how much guilt you have, no matter how much shame you have about something you've done that you wish you could take back, it's always the same. Don't run from, run back to, let me restore you, and be obedient. Obedient to what? Death. Sounds morbid. Death to yourself so that you can have life in me. That's been Jesus consistently from the beginning, right? Peter's first confession, big faith, right? Loses himself, big failure. Jesus, you are the Christ. Oh, Peter, you're the man. Yeah, I am. Pulls Jesus aside, big failure, right? What does Jesus say right after that? Pick up your cross and follow after me. That's what it means to follow me. Peter's restoration. What does Jesus say at the end of it? He says, when you're older, they're going to lead you where you don't want to go. They're going to stretch out your arms. That's describing crucifixion. So he says again, even after he restores him, you're going to glorify me by your death. So same response. Big faith, lose who we are, big failure, response, obedience. Big faith, lose who you are, big failure, response, obedience. Your big faith, you losing who you are, that sin that you have that you wish nobody knows about, that you're sitting in guilt and shame, your response is the same. Death to yourself. That's why we celebrate baptism here so much. That's why it's incredible what God's doing now. 30-something baptisms here this year or whatever. That is our symbol that somebody said enough is enough. No more inconsistency. From this moment forward, I'm all in. I am dead to myself so that I can be alive in Jesus. That's what baptism is. It shows the world from now on, I'm not running away anymore. I'm running to. I'm going to die to myself. So I stop doing what I want and I start doing what he wants so that I can step into my purpose to glorify God. And when we do that, we don't have to sit outside the gate weeping. We get to have close, intimate relationship with Jesus. So that's what I'm asking you to remember this morning. No matter what your shame, no matter what your guilt, no matter what your sin, his response is always the same. He died for it. He beat it. Our response has to be the same too. We run back to him. We let him restore us. And we die to ourselves and say, you know what? Jesus, I am yours. Amen. Would you pray with me this morning? Father God, I thank you so much that despite our running, the moment we turn back, you are there waiting. And so God, I don't know the struggle. I don't know the shame and the guilt of every person in here. I know my own shame. I know my own guilt. But God, you take it all equally. And so what we ask you to do this morning is to just give people the courage to bring that shame, to bring that guilt to you, to run back to you, to turn back to you, to let you restore them so they can live in their purpose, they can live in their freedom, so they don't have to be weeping outside the gate, but God, so they can be embracing you, experiencing your love and grace. So God, as we worship you this morning through song, I just ask that your Spirit would move in us, that you'd move through us, convict us of the things that we don't even know that we've prioritized above you. God, call us home and let us respond. It's in Jesus' name I pray.